How the U.S. destroyed itself by borrowing from China the day China became America's banker. On September 29, 2008, the lights of Lower Manhattan stayed on, but the balance sheet went dark. People think America nearly fell because of panic, greed, and bad mortgages. That's the fairy tale the news sold. The truth is colder. The ledger cracked, the credit line snapped, and insolvency stared back through the glass. Everyone loves to blame a villain with a face, a banker in a suit, a traitor with bloodshot eyes. But history doesn't really move to speeches or sirens. It moves to numbers in a column, to liabilities that grow teeth. America didn't lose control because it lacked power. It lost control because it treated bankruptcy like a rumor. At the peak, the United States looked untouchable, like a marble statue that could never chip. Aircraft carriers cut through oceans like steel sermons. The dollar walked into any country and got served first. The parades were digital, stringed through stock tickers and glossy consumer aisles. You could feel that power in the everyday air. Gas stations were full, shelves were stuffed, and credit cards slid like keys into every locked door. Homes got bigger, cars got heavier, and interest felt like an afterthought. The nation glittered, but the glitter was financed. Because beneath the surface the foundation was rotting, not from invasion or plague, but from quiet habits. The habit of buying without earning, the habit of spending without saving, the habit of calling debt growth and calling the bill tomorrow. The empire of modern America wasn't built only on factories and farms. It was built on confidence, and confidence has a price. The price was the bond market, the place where nations kneel without admitting it. The bond market doesn't cheer. It calculates. Go back to August 15, 1971, when the United States changed the rules of reality. The old story says America modernized money, made it flexible, made it free. But the ledger tells another story. The gold link was cut, and the dollar became a promise floating in the dark. That promise gave America a strange superpower. It could create dollars faster than it could mine gold. It could run deficits without immediate pain. It could buy time, year after year, by issuing paper claims on the future. But a fiat empire still needs believers. If the world stops trusting your paper, you're not a titan anymore. You're a debtor with a printing press. So the United States built a new altar for faith, and the altar was oil priced in dollars. By 1974, deals in the Middle East helped lock global energy trade to the U.S. currency. If a country wanted oil, it needed dollars. If it needed dollars, it needed to earn them or borrow them. Demand for dollars became automatic, like gravity, and America's deficits found willing hands. This is where the addiction started. It wasn't an explosion. It was a drip, then a flow, then a flood. Borrowing became a tool, then a reflex, then a necessity. Debt wasn't a chain yet, but it was already wrapped around the ankle. Think of use debt like a living thing. It feeds when politicians promise more than taxes can cover. It grows when wars eat budgets and voters demand painless miracles. It whispers that interest is cheap and consequences are far away. It is a monster that looks like comfort. The antagonist in this story is not a general. It's the creditor class, the bondholders, the cold-eyed market that decides what your promises are worth. In the American case, the antagonist wore many masks: the Treasury auction, the Foreign Reserve Manager, the invisible committee of global savers. For a long time, the creditors were friends. Japan, Europe, oil exporters, partners who enjoyed America's stability. When allies hold your debt, it feels like trust. You start believing the bills will always be paid. You start thinking insolvency is something that happens to weaker countries. Then a new player learned the rules. Not by shouting, but by exporting. Not by invading, but by accumulating. China stepped onto the stage with empty pockets and an iron plan. It didn't need to defeat America in battle. It only needed to become essential. In 1978, China's economy was still bruised and struggling, but reforms turned the country into a workshop with no sleep. Factories multiplied, ports widened, and wages stayed low enough to keep the machines humming. The world saw cheap goods. China saw leverage. Here's the trick that built the trap. When China sold goods to America, it got paid in dollars. Those dollars didn't just sit in a drawer. They became a growing pile of foreign currency that China's system needed to manage. To keep exports competitive, the yuan stayed controlled and dollars got recycled. Those recycled dollars needed a parking lot. The safest, deepest, most liquid parking lot in the world was US Treasury bonds. So China began buying the American future, one auction at a time. Not because it loved America, but because the system pushed it there. By the time the 1990s ended, the cycle was already vicious. Americans wanted cheaper everything. Big retailers wanted endless inventory. Factories in the U.S. closed, but the checkout lines stayed full. The trade deficit became a quiet engine powering the illusion. Let that number sink in. In 1990, America's annual goods deficit with China was around $10 billion. By 2000, it had climbed to roughly $83 billion. By 2010, it had reached about $273 billion. A river of dollars flowing west across the Pacific. The ledger doesn't care about flags. It only cares about flows. Those flows became circular, almost poetic in their cruelty. America bought Chinese goods. China collected dollars. China bought U.S. debt. America spent the borrowed money. America bought more goods. This loop felt like a miracle machine. Consumers got low prices. Politicians avoided hard choices. Interest rates stayed tame because foreign buying supported bond demand. It looked like prosperity. It was leverage wearing perfume. But leverage always has a smell. It smells like dependency. The moment you need someone else to keep buying your bonds, your sovereignty is no longer absolute. It becomes conditional, like a loan agreement with invisible signatures. By 2008, the machinery seized. The housing bubble burst, and the financial system began choking on its own paper. That year, the Federal Reserve and Treasury stared into a pit where liquidity should have been. Banks didn't trust banks. Credit froze like blood in winter. The public saw it as a Wall Street crisis, a rich man's fire. The ledgers saw it as something simpler, a solvency scare in the heart of the empire. The balance sheet of America's financial system wasn't a proud monument. It was a maze of hidden liabilities. The rule of three hit like a hammer. The mortgage were sour. The credit was frozen. The confidence evaporated. And when confidence evaporates, even giants start begging. America needed to borrow on a historic scale to stabilize the system. Trillions were thrown into backstops, guarantees, bailouts, emergency programs. The Treasury issued mountains of debt, and someone had to buy it. The question was not moral. It was mechanical, and China kept buying. In the darkest hours when America's financial brand was bleeding on live television, China still showed up at the auction window. Some called it faith. Some called it cooperation, but it wasn't love. It was self-preservation, because China was trapped in its own success. By then, it held an enormous pile of dollar assets. If the dollar collapsed, China's reserves would burn. If US Treasuries failed, China's savings would take the blast. So China acted like a creditor funding a shaky debtor to protect the earlier loans. This is where the story turns noir. The creditor and the debtor both realize the other has a knife. America realized it was depending on a rival to finance its life. China realized it held paper claims that could shake markets. But paper claims are a dangerous weapon. China's holdings climbed and peaked around 2011 at about $1.3 trillion in treasuries. Trillion, not million, not billion. A number so big it stops being math and becomes weather. That pile of U.S. debt was China's vault of influence and also its cage. People started talking about China owning America. But ownership is the wrong word. A bond is not a crown. A bond is a contract, and contracts bind both sides. If China dumped treasuries, bond prices would fall, and China would bleed first. Mutually assured destruction, but with spreadsheets instead of missiles. If China sold, yields would spike, the dollar could weaken, and U.S. markets would convulse. But China's export engine would stall, and its own financial system would eat losses. The gun was pointed both ways. Meanwhile, America kept living like the credit line was eternal. After 2008, debt didn't shrink. It grew. In 2008, U.S. federal debt hovered around $10 trillion. By 2023, it had surged beyond $33 trillion, a mountain built from political convenience. Debt service became a shadow tax. Interest payments started consuming more of the budget, quietly crowding out other spending. The nation wasn't just borrowing for investment. It was borrowing to maintain the present, to avoid pain, to postpone choices. Here comes the smoking gun moment, the foreclosure in slow motion. It isn't one treaty with wax seals. It's a ritual that repeats, the Treasury auction, where the United States sells pieces of its future. Imagine a room where the fate of sovereignty is decided with bids. The dialogue is brutal when you translate it into human language. America says, "Here is my bond. Pay me today." The market replies, "At what yield and under what trust?" And China, watching the transaction, says nothing, because silence is power in a negotiation. Every auction is a small liquidation sale of tomorrow. Every deficit is a new lien placed on a generation that didn't sign the contract. The country kept refinancing its lifestyle, and the creditor kept buying, because the loop kept feeding both. But the bill always collects. It collects through inflation, through currency tension, through political fracture. It collects through weakened industry, through hollowed supply chains, through strategic anxiety. Even when the checks clear, the cost is real. By the early 2020s, the relationship shifted again. China began trimming exposure, slowly, cautiously, like a diver rising to the surface without triggering the bends. By 2023, holdings had fallen to roughly $850 billion. Still huge, but no longer climbing. That reduction wasn't a surrender, it was a signal. China wanted options. It wanted alternatives to dollar risk. It wanted to trade without bowing to the U.S. financial gate. It wanted to rewrite the rules that had once humiliated it. America, meanwhile, argued with itself in public. Debt ceilings became theater. Shut-down threats became bargaining chips. The world watched a debtor nation flirt with self-inflicted default, not because it couldn't pay, but because it couldn't agree. And here is the climax, the default that doesn't need a missed payment to feel real. The default is the moment a nation realizes its choices are constrained by its balance sheet. The default is psychological first. The markets sense it before the headlines do. You can see the social consequences without a single official bankruptcy stamp. Wages that don't keep up with living costs. Housing that becomes unreachable. Anger that fills the streets and the comment sections. Humiliation that doesn't look like invasion, but feels like decline. Because sovereignty is solvency. A nation that cannot fund itself without begging is not fully free. A nation that prints to escape pressure is still paying, just in a different currency. A nation that depends on rivals for supply chains and credit leves on borrowed oxygen. Now think about the human scale. Picture a young worker in Ohio watching a factory close, told its global efficiency. Picture a young worker in Guangdong pulling 12-hour shifts, told its national development. Both are trapped by the same ledger. One side consumes, the other produces. One side issues debt. The other side buys it. It looks like strategy. It is also addiction. And addiction always ends the same way, with withdrawal or collapse or a painful reinvention. The generational aftermath is the part nobody wants to narrate. Debt doesn't die when presidents leave office. It sits there, compounding, rolling forward like a snowball with interest. Even if the crisis is delayed, the scar remains. You can measure scars in years and payments. Long after the speeches, the interest still runs. Long after the flags, the bond coupons still get clipped. The final check is rarely written in one dramatic scene. It's written slowly through decades of constraint. And here's the noir lesson that keeps returning, century after century. The winner isn't the one with the loudest army. The winner is the one with the cleanest balance sheet and the deepest cash reserves. The ledger picks favorites without asking permission. So when you hear that America destroyed itself by borrowing from China, don't imagine one fatal mistake. Imagine 1,000 small choices, each one defensible, each one convenient, each one adding another line to the liabilities column. That's how empires fall now. China didn't become America's banker by conquest. It became the banker by showing up every day, exporting, collecting, recycling, and buying the paper. America didn't lose its edge in one war. It lost it in the quiet comfort of cheap credit. Think about the scale of that. A rival nation holding hundreds of billions in your debt is not a headline. It's a pressure point embedded in the system. It changes how you negotiate, how you plan, how you panic. It changes the psychology of power. The future isn't written yet, and that's the dangerous part. America could rebuild production, reduce deficits, and treat debt like a warning. China could find alternatives and still remain tied to the dollar's gravity. Or the system could snap under stress none of us predict. But the ledger will decide. It always does. The accountants will outlive the admirals. The bond market will outlast the slogans. And the real thriller is that the ending is being calculated right now in interest rates, auctions, and trade flows. If you want to understand the next chapter before it hits the headlines, Stay close to the balance sheet. Subscribe to the channel because most people watch history like a movie. You'll learn to read it like a ledger before the ink dries.